This morning, I'd like to start off with a question, and you feel free to respond. What are some of the things you really love? What are some of the things you really love? How about a couple people shout out some things they love? Family. We love our family. What else? Not everybody at once. I can't handle all the responses. You love the church. You always gave the right answer in Sunday school, right? Yes. You know, it reminds me of a story. You know, there was a Sunday school teacher, and he was saying to the kids, you know, what's brown and loves to go up and down trees and loves nuts? And Steve was in the class at the time, and he raised his hand. He says, Jesus. He goes, I know I should have said squirrel, but I know the answer's Jesus, you know. And yeah. So, Steve, you get that answer, loving your church. What else? What are some things we love? Food. I shared, I think a couple weeks ago, I love cheesecake. Factory, I love to go there and get my peanut butter ripple, whatever. It is really good. I love Mexican food. What else do we love? My spouse. Okay. Spouse. We love, does anybody love football? Sports. Yes, some of us are sports junkies. We can't live without it. Some of us love our country. Some of us love Indiana. Some of us would never dream of doing what I've done over the course of my life, traveling around all these different places. We love Indiana. We love where we live, and whether it's on the lake or on the farm, we love where we live. Today, though, I do want to talk about Steve's answer about loving the church, because for some of us, if we're honest, we can even be here today and not love the church. You know, there's a lot of things sometimes to not like about the church. Sometimes we don't like the pastor. Sometimes we don't like today, you know, some of us say it's too cold in here, you know. Sometimes we don't like the temperature in the church. It's too hot, it's too cold. Sometimes we don't like the songs we sing. Sometimes we don't like just the way the church appears aesthetically, or something used to be here and now it's missing and we get distracted. Or sometimes we don't like the conflict in the church. Sometimes we don't like the attitude of certain people. Sometimes we just don't like coming to church. And I want to talk about loving the church today. You see, I think one of the things that happens, especially in that series we did, Dream Big in Small Places and in Small Churches, a lot of times if you're in a small place and you're in a small church and you attend church, you think that the job of the pastor or the job of the church is to grow the church, right? Just if we could get more people in the church, then church would be right. But I got a question. What is that number that would make it just right? Is it 100? Is it 200? I've served in churches up to 2,000 before. I can tell you, there's a lot of people that are in churches of 2,000 that don't like their church. They don't love their church just because of the size. You see, our job is not to grow the church. Our job is to love the church and to love our pastor. And this is why I'm doing this series, because I think it is so important for us to understand the calling that we have. Last week we learned a couple of verses, and I would love for us to read these verses together. I don't know if you can see this or not, but I'd love for us just to read this to remember what's love got to do with it, sort of loving the church, loving your pastor. So let's read that together. It says, "Dear friends, let us love one another. For love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love." So the case I was trying to make last week, that being a Christ follower means we should love our church and we should love our pastor and we should love each other. And what it reveals is that we truly have been born again, but it also reveals that we know God. And we know who God is, and we know the love that Christ has for us. But we also looked at this verse. It says, let's read this again out loud. It says, "Dear friends, since God so loved us, we ought to love one another." You see, because God has loved us, we are obligated to understand that our goal is to love one another. So when I talk about loving your church, I want to be very clear. I'm talking about us loving each other. Now again, sometimes it's hard. Some of you probably are loving this social distancing, you know. I don't have to sit too close to anybody. I don't have to get too close. I don't even have to talk to anybody. I can just come to church and put up the walls and I'm fine. But we need to understand when this whole pandemic is gone, our goal in the midst of the pandemic, but after the pandemic, is for us to love each other and to encourage each other and to support each other, because that is what God has called us to do. Now there's 3 truths that I want us to know before we look at our passage today. It doesn't matter the size of our church. It doesn't matter the size of our church. We are called to love each other. I talk to people all the time, and I work with churches and I work with pastors. The size does not determine whether you love your church or not. Like I said, I've served in some large churches, and I can tell you there's some people that don't love large churches. There may be some people that don't love small churches, but I'm here to tell you this morning, when Jesus says that we are to love one another, he never was thinking about the size of the church. I mean, just think about it. How big was Jesus' church? You know, basically, Jesus had 12 guys following them around. 12 guys. And in those 12 guys, he had 3 of them that he was really close to. Peter, James, and John. It doesn't matter the size. We are called to love the church. If you go back and read the Gospels, did the disciples always love each other? No, they were fighting a lot of times. So it doesn't matter size. It doesn't matter the location. It doesn't matter where we're located. Again, I've had the privilege, lived in San Diego, lived near Kansas City, I've lived in Fort Wayne, I've lived in Columbia City, I've lived in all these different places, and it doesn't matter the location. We're called to love each other, and we're called to love the church. And the last one I think is so important truth, is that it really doesn't matter our history. We're called to love the church. As I've worked with churches, especially churches that are on the older spectrum, not in the age of the congregants, but in the age of the church, sometimes people have trouble loving the church because they say, oh, we have all these good memories in the past. I mean, I admit it, I love to watch a good Andy Griffith. But dreaming, wouldn't it be nice to be back in the days of Andy Griffith? It's just a little ridiculous, isn't it? Because I'm telling you, Opie still got beat up by bullies in Andy Griffith's time. And Andy and Barney, last time I checked, they never really got married, did they? And they were always fighting with their girlfriends, and there was still crime, and you had Otis getting drunk all the time, and a lot of crazy things were happening to Andy Griffith. Remembering the past and our history doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we understand our job is to love the church. I want to share one quote before we open up and look at Ephesians 5. Look at this quote by Carl Vaders. He says, maybe the reason there are so many small churches is that small churches was God's idea. And the reason I want to share that this morning is because I find that small churches in small places, sometimes they really struggle the most in liking their church and loving their church. They find their church sort of unattractive or embarrassing But without boring you with numbers, we need to understand something. 90% of the churches in America, maybe almost 95% of the churches in America are small churches. And so we need to wrap our idea. If we're waiting for a big church or a bigger church, we're missing the mark. God's idea was maybe for churches to be smaller, that it would be easier for us to love each other and to love the church and to love the pastor if it really wasn't large. One quote I read a couple weeks ago, it says that small churches are spending money trying to get large, and large churches are spending money trying to get small. Why are large churches spending money trying to get small? Because they understand that it's harder to get relationships going, community going, friendships going in a large church. So today I want to answer the question why we should all love the church. And so if you would, open up your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. And hopefully maybe you were there earlier. I'm not going to be sharing a lot of verses up on the screen, though I'm going to be sharing some points on the screen. And so here's what I want us to see in Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. You see, I think a lot of us struggle with Ephesians chapter 5 because we look at it through the marriage context. And so the first thing we see when we look at Ephesians chapter 5 is it starts off in verse 22, wives, submit to your own husbands. We don't like that word submit, right? We look at that and we're like, oh, what's going on here? And wives, submit to your husbands. I don't think Paul didn't really realize he wasn't from our century. He knows this isn't relevant anymore. Paul didn't understand there was a feminist movement that occurred in our generation. So we can be like Thomas Jefferson. We just can cut this out of the Bible, right? But no, this is not something that we need to take like offense to. This is something we need to look at because it's going to be very important on how we view the church. Wives, submit to your husbands. Why? Because that is a word I'm going to steal from last week that I shared. It's captivating. Isn't it captivating when a wife submits to her husband, especially if the husband doesn't deserve it? Say the husband is not very loving, not very kind, not very gracious, not very warm, not very accepting. And a wife submits to her husband, that is captivating. That's attractive. People are looking at it and saying, well, what's going on? But look at the second one. Husbands, love your wives. That's captivating as well. Especially when a husband loves his wife that maybe isn't overly nice or kind. Maybe she sort of nags him a little bit and is controlling and is angry a lot and bitter a lot. If a husband's able to love his wife who maybe isn't deserving of love, that is really attractive. And when a wife submits to a husband and a husband loves the wife, especially when there is some, you fill in the blank of some sin issue that is overwhelming, that is really, sometimes we say to ourselves, if we hear of a story, I could never do that. I couldn't find myself doing that. And there's something attractive, there's something that is captivating about that. The reason is because we are talking about Christ and the church. Do you notice that in each of the challenges to the husband and the wife, it says, just as Christ. This passage is talking about Christ and the church. If you go back and you circle the word Christ or he and himself, I counted 10 times Christ is referred to in this passage. This isn't talking about marriage. This is talking about Christ and the church. And Christ loves the church. It's his bride. The reason that every Christ follower should love the church, it's the bride of Christ. And because it is the bride of Christ, Christ loves her. We should love her too. And this love is also captivating. Christ's love for the church is captivating. Why? Because he loves us and we're sinners. Christ loves us even though we are sinners. This is so true. I'm a pastor. I'll just talk for myself a little bit. As a pastor, I have some bad days. I have some days when I doubt God's love for me. I have days when I probably watch something I shouldn't watch. I hear something I shouldn't hear. And ask Michelle and my kids. I say a lot of things I should never say. I have a lot of things that I do in my life, even as a pastor. And you know what? Does Christ still love me in all of that? You betcha. He loves me. And his love is overwhelming. In fact, Paul in another place in Romans 8 says that there is nothing I can do that can separate me from the love of God. That God is so amazingly in love with me that he cares for me. It's unconditional. And when we start putting up conditions in the church, we're missing the mark. We're missing the mark of what it means to love the bride of Christ. My older children have not yet gotten married. But I know when I go to a wedding, and a lot of times, let's just assume there's no major issues, but when you go to a wedding and it's the daughter-in-law, not the daughter, I notice that the in-laws, again, if they're normal, healthy in-laws, they love that daughter-in-law, don't they? And then when that daughter-in-law starts having what? Kids, and they become grandkids, everybody is in love with the bride. They're in love with the wife. They're in love with the children. This should start going through our minds saying, if the church is the bride of Christ, we should be loving the church as well, and we should be loving fellow Christians who are the children, the byproduct of the church. It was interesting. There was a show on this week, and I forget who was watching it, but I got sort of intrigued. It was called Love at First Sight. Has anybody seen this show? I don't recommend it, but it's sort of crazy. But they had 3 counselors interview all these couples, and they picked 4 couples to get married without ever seeing the person ever in their life. I don't know, would you do that? I would not do that. But I was sort of intrigued. And I sort of watched this because I wanted to see the person coming out when they're seeing the groom, the wife or the bride, when she sees the groom up here for the very first time. Talk about awkward. They're exchanging vows with each other. They are having to kiss each other for the first time. They have cameras on them. They go and they have some champagne together and they talk about their families. They're meeting their families for the first time. And I'm like, oh, come on. This is not love at first sight. This is stupidity at first sight. That's not how love works. That's not how love works. And when we see that Christ loves the church and Christ loves us, we love him back because we have a relationship with him. And that's the way it should be in the church. So I want to give you 4 practical ways that I see in this passage that we need to love the church. So the first one is found in Ephesians 5, verse 1. It says, therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. If I convinced you that, yes, I need to love the church and I love my pastor, but how do I do it? This is the how. We love like Christ. That means we love sacrificially, we love unconditionally. Sometimes we love to the point where it actually hurts. I would say we love to the point where we actually die, where we have to give up something. That's what it means to love as Christ loved the church. Can you imagine if we were all so unselfish and weren't obsessed with the love that we receive when we come to church, that all we could focus on is, I'm going to love people like Jesus loved today. I don't know what you were thinking when you were driving over here today. You were looking at the temperature and saying it's cooler, or maybe you were having a discussion in the car. Maybe you were having a fight in the car. I don't know what you were having, but were you thinking, I need to love like Christ loves today? That is what the church is all about, my friends. We need to love like Christ loved us. You remember this verse from last week, from 1 John chapter 5? I think we got it up there on the screen. Let's look at this verse here. Notice what he says in 1 John chapter 5. He says, this is how God... Yeah, go back. It's right. Here we go. Notice what it says. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his only one and only Son, Jesus Christ, into the world so that we might live through him. This is God's love for us. This is love. Not that we love God, but that he loved us. This is the type of love we need to have. Last week I tried to make a case that this love is sacrificial, but it is also spiritual. If I had a long time to do this series, I would make the case that yes, taking care of one another's physical needs is important. Material needs. That's one of the ways we express our love. And most churches have like a deacon's fund or a benevolence fund or a community fund where we take care of these needs. But this love that Jesus demonstrated, it is spiritual. It's making sure we're taking care of one another spiritually and making sure we're looking after each other's love for one another. So the first way that we love is we love like Christ. Notice again in verse 25, it says, husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. This is what we need to be doing. We need to be giving ourselves up for each other. Then notice this. It says that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word. Holiness, purity, righteousness. That's how we love. If you let your eyes go back to verse 3 of chapter 5, it says, but sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not be named among you, as is proper for the saints. Let there be no filthiness or foolish talk, nor crude joking, which is out of place, but rather let there be thanksgiving. One of the things we don't talk about in church is the sexual immorality that exists in the church today. Pornography, affairs. Sometimes it's divorce, sometimes it's remarriage, sometimes some of these issues are creeping into the church. Sometimes it's our talk, the way we talk to each other. My heart is breaking. I've been watching over the last 10 years, pastor after pastor after pastor who has fallen because of sexually immoral issues. One of the ways we love like Christ loves the church is that we are sexually pure in our relationships with each other. I remember pastoring at one church, and one of the elders who was older, he struggled with pornography his whole life. And I gave a message at the church, similar to one of the messages I gave from Revelation 2 earlier this spring, where we need to love We need to return to our first love in the church. And I was talking about purity, and the same individual told me about the pastor who stored Playboys up behind the altar. And I remember being at one church and hearing the story about during even revivals that was happening, that as they looked over the balcony, sometimes they saw people who weren't married even holding hands. This type of stuff cannot happen in the church. For us to love the church, we need to be pure, we need to be righteous, we need to be holy. Here's a couple other ways. We need to submit to the church as to Christ. Notice in verse 22, it says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord." And again, we need to understand this is found in the context of verse 21, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. You see, we submit to Jesus Christ first and foremost. This passage that we're talking about, we think it's talking about marriage, but it's talking about Christ's love for the church and Christ's lordship over the church. And the way you love your church is by submitting to his lordship. That means he calls the shots in the church. And we listen to him, we listen to his voice. But it is also not only us submitting to Christ, but it's us submitting to one another. This whole passage is built upon us submitting to one another. That's how we show our love to the church. Submitting to one another, we think sometimes it's a harsh word, but it isn't. It's basically saying, I'm going to put someone else up at a higher place than myself. I'm not going to put myself in the first slot. I'm going to put myself in the second slot. What would church be like if everybody wasn't saying, I wish I was in the first spot. I want to be in the second spot. I'm not concerned about getting the glory or the awards, but I'm concerned more about serving others. That's how we show our love. We love like Christ, and we submit to Christ, and we submit to one another. The last thing that I just want to share with us is we also need to respect each other. Notice in verse 33, it says, however, let each one of us, or each one of you, love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. When I speak at weddings and officiate a wedding, one of the things I say is that the husband loves and leads, and the wife respects and responds to her husband's leadership. This is what we do when we show love. We respect the church. You know, the church is one of the vehicles or one of the ways that God has given our culture in our world to be salt and light, to be hope. And we need to respect it because it's the bride of Christ, but we need to respect it because without the church, the world would be totally crazy. We need to respect that the church is the thing that God said that Christ will build. Christ said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He's saying that the church is what God is up to in this kingdom. And we need to respect it. And where we're going to go in October, next week we're going to continue to talk about the church, but you also need to respect your pastor. And I'm not saying that because I'm your transitional interim right now and I'm looking for respect. You guys have done a great job, I feel, of respecting me and honoring me, and I really appreciate that. But when it comes to loving your church and loving your pastor, there's about respect for the pastor. You can go back and look at 1 Corinthians 16 when you get home, and there's a passage in there that talks about us submitting to one another and respecting one another. And it says also each other, but it also says to the one who is leading you, the one who is guiding you, the one who is serving you. We need to show respect. Hebrews 13 says that we should honor and obey and respect our leaders, because guess what? The pastor is going to have to stand before Christ himself and give an account. James, the brother of Jesus, said, not many of you should presume to be teachers. Why? Because you're going to have a stricter judgment and accountability when you meet Christ. We need to respect the office of being a pastor, but we need to respect the person of being a pastor. So why, if I could leave with one final word, why should all of us love our church and love our pastor? Because it's the bride of Christ. Pure and simple, it's the bride of Christ. And love is the measure. It is the standard of what church is all about. Let us pray. Father, I thank you for this church. And dear Lord, some dear people here, some godly people, some people that have been following you for a very long time. And I pray, dear Lord, that we can all come together and we can all agree that why we're still here is so that we can love you and love each other. And I pray, dear Lord, as we love each other, that this will be so captivating, so attractive. Not that we'll draw others to a church service, but that we will draw others towards you in a relationship with you. Help us, dear Lord, to love the church. For when we love the church, then the church will get healthy and it will grow. So we thank you, dear Lord, for what your word has to say. And help us, dear Lord, not just to be hearers of the word, but help us to be doers of the word. And everyone said, amen.